So tonight's program is going to be taught by Jenny Thompson, and she's kind of a jack of all trades for us there at UW. She puts out the magazine Barnyards and Backyards. She does season extension. She does vegetable gardening. She does seed starting. And I'm sure there's a whole list of other things that you do that I'm not aware of. So from the University of Wyoming is Jenny, and she's going to teach advanced seed starting for you guys tonight. So Jenny, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for everybody giving up this lovely evening. At least it's a lovely evening here in Laramie, so with the weather. So to come to the class. I can't see you, so feel free to holler out your questions really loud, or if I'm boring you to death, please let me know because I won't be able to see you're falling asleep. So, but we'll go ahead and get started. And I put together a few slides to kind of talk a little bit about why we might want to do this and different ways of doing it. So I'm going to share out my screen here. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, and if you have any questions anytime, like I said, just holler them out. Don't feel like you're interrupting. I like questions. I sometimes can't answer them. So why would you want to do this? Well, a lot of you that have been doing this will know that sometimes you can't find the plants that you want elsewhere. So you have to start them yourself. And another reason is if you've ever collected seed, I'm very interested in native plants. So I collect a lot of seed from around here. And so the only way I can get those started is to do some of these techniques. Hi, now I can see you a little bit.
A little bit.
And also it's just a fun challenge as gardeners. We are always looking for something a little bit different. And so this is a kind of challenging thing. If you have any questions about any of the plants that you see that I put on the screen, just feel free to ask. The first thing you want to decide before you start all this is choose what you want to grow. That's always a big choice for us as gardeners. There's a lot of plants out there. There's a lot to choose from. So with dormancy, there's a lot of seeds that don't really have much dormancy. So most of our vegetable plants are this way, of course. And part of it is that humans have selected them for thousands and thousands of years, and we kind of did away with the dormancy of some of the species. Others just aren't very dormant because they don't need to be. But the main reason for dormancy is that it prevents the seed germinating at the wrong time. Because if they germinate at the wrong time, they're going to die. So there are a couple different kinds of dormancy. And so there are ones that involve like the outside of the seed coat, and there's others that involve the inside, the kind of where the embryo is. So you guys are probably thinking, oh my gosh, look at that chart, looks awful. But it's just a kind of chart to kind of go through some of the different types of dormancy, just to keep them in your mind. You don't have to remember any of these. The process of breaking dormancy and growing some of these plants is pretty easy. At least the techniques are. Sometimes it doesn't work and sometimes it does. So, but some of the different types we have here are that the seed or fruit coat's not permeable to water. So the water and the oxygen have to get in so that the embryo can start growing and germinating. And so for some of those, the germination occurs within 2 weeks of it being scarified. So that means, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but you break the seed coat and that allows the water and the oxygen to go in, and then it'll start germinating. Another type is if you do that and it doesn't germinate, then it probably has a different kind of dormancy. The other kind of dormancy is that the water can get in, but then the embryos may not be ready to go. And so that's a different kinds of dormancy, and we'll talk about some techniques for getting over that one. In other ones, the embryo is ready to go, but sometimes they need to go through a kind of the cold stratification that we're going to talk about process to kind of start them on their journey to germinating. So that's a little bit about those. So the good news about that kind of complicated chart is that most of the dormancy that you'll run across can be overcome by a few simple things. And one of these that's most common with the kind of plants that I like, which are kind of our native plants from around here, are the temperate and Arctic native plants, is that it can be overcome with cold stratification, which is a pretty simple process that we'll talk about. Or it can also be overcome by just holding on to the seeds for a long time. I don't know if you've ever had that happen if you're into growing wildflowers and you've had the seed a long time. I had some Penstemon seed I started the other year that had been sitting around for 10 years, and it germinated probably better than it did when it was fresh when I started it. So sometimes the dormant seed just kind of wears off over time. Do you guys have any questions about any of that? All right. So another thing to know is that dormancy can vary genetically within the same lot from year to year, or the same location, or depending where the plants were. So you might think about a plant that may be the same species, but there's some that's growing at the top of a mountain, and there's some that's growing at the bottom. And so the one that is at the top might need a lot more dormancy to make it through its life cycle than the one at the bottom. And so as an example of this, let's see, I was going to show you a couple examples of my seed. So in part, this is a lesson of what not to do, because my seedlings got a little strung out this year. They're a little longer than they're meant to be, because when they were germinating, I was away. And so they stretched a little bit. But this is a Penstemon. That's that one in the bottom that's all blue. It's called Grand Mesa Penstemon. Penstemons mensorum, excuse me. And so this is one lot of seed. This is a different lot of seed that's from a different plant. So you can see the germination rates were pretty variable. So that sometimes happens. So if you're not successful, sometimes it's just a matter of the kind of seed lot that you got. And maybe it was one that just had a little more dormancy than the other one. All right. So we're going to get into some of the techniques for overcoming this kind of dormancy that you'll find in plants. And one of them is called scarification. So it's the one I was talking about where the seed coat's hard. And so you need to somehow break it so that the water and oxygen can get in. So in nature, this occurs through abrasion. So for a while, I lived in Arizona. And so it's a desert climate, but every once in a while, they get these big old thunderstorms that roll through, and the arroyos fill up with water, and all the gravel and sand that go through there start rolling around. And there's seed in there, and they get tumbled with the rocks and the sand, and it kind of wears away the seed coat. So that's one way they get through that abrasion. Here it could be through rocks or wind. Abrasion with sand is another way. Another way this happens is through the stomachs of animals. So if you have a bird that eats a berry, it goes through their stomach. There's acid, it strips away the pulp around it, and then it can also kind of eat into the seed a little bit. Other ways are fire, freezing, and thawing. And then if a seed lands on the ground, the fungi and stuff can start to kind of decay the seed a little bit and allow the water to get in. So this is a very common kind of feature of lagoons. So everything that's in the pea family. And then also with the mallows. So the ones that are related kind of to hollyhocks and that kind of family. So this one in the little picture with the real flat one is a little bitty native plant from around here. And I grew some this year. And so it's one of the ones that has a pea or bean-like parentage. And so I believe I did it with sandpaper. I rubbed it and then I put it and soaked it and germinated it. And so it's germinated pretty well. So this year it's germinated a lot better than it has a couple other years when I started it. And that may be because in addition to the scarification, it needs a little time to break down and get ready to grow. So that little guy is only like maybe 2 or 3 inches in nature. You'll see it when you're driving along the road. It'll be this kind of flat mat of really beautiful purple and pink kind of blooms. So the one on the left is the one your guys are going to be working on. It's the false indigo. And so that you have that in your plant supply. So it's another one that where you use scarification. Any questions on that? There's different techniques for scarification. Let me stop sharing for a little. Oh, I know. I think I'm going to see if I can turn off my background because you guys will be able to see things better if I have it turned off. So for scarification, there's various things that you can use, and part of it depends how big the seed is. So I think you guys are going to be using some sandpaper. So that's one way you do it. So the trick with scarification with the legumes, the pea family ones, is that you try to rub it to get through the seed coat, but not so hard that you get too far in or that you, and I've done this before, reduce it to dust. So that's a little too hard. So it takes a little practice depending on the size of the seed. If the size, excuse me, if the seed is bigger, you can use a file and excuse me, I have a tickle. So you can basically hold the seed and file it. Excuse me. You can also use a fingernail file if you've got one. So you imagine taking a bean seed and you can just file on it. And so with the legumes, if the seeds are big enough, you know how a bean seed is kind of curved. So it's got the curved rounded side and it's got the other side where it's kind of curved in. Where you want to do it is on the side that's not bent in. So the opposite side of that. Because in bean seeds or legumes, the little plantlet tends to be on the side where it's curved in. And you don't want to hurt it. What you want to do is you want to make a little hole on the other side because that's where it stores all its starch and stuff to grow. And it doesn't really hurt it much if you chip some of that away. And then another way for some seeds is you can use a little fingernail clippers. You can imagine flax seeds that you can clip a little way to allow the water and oxygen in. So some other methods of scarification are hot water. And so Catherine talked about you're going to be doing some of that tonight. So that's good for like the mallows. I was doing some caloroi or poppy seed the other night, and that's a good one for hot water treatment. A lot of times what you do is you take your seed, you pour the hot water in, and then you'll leave it for like the calorois, the poppy mallows, you'll leave it overnight. And so that helps break down the seed coat and the water starts to go in. Other ways are dry heat. So they'll do this in like an oven for some pine cones and things, and you have to be kind of careful with the heat to make sure you don't heat it too high and it'll kill it. And then some folks use acid. So some of the big commercial seed places will use sulfuric acid to break the seed coat, but I do not recommend that for people doing it at home. It's pretty dangerous stuff. Any questions on scarification? Does that all make sense?
Jenny,
Uh-huh.
I have a question. Can we get a copy of your presentation tonight?
Sure. I'll make it into a PDF and send it to Catherine. She can send it out to you.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure.
How do you know when to use whatever technique?
So that's one of the things we'll talk about. I'll show you later where you can actually find the sources where they'll tell you what to do. But if with these, if it's a pea plant, it's a legume of some type. And sometimes the information is just not available for some of the real unique native plants. But if I know it's an astragalus or it's a milk vetch or it's a local weed or something in that family, that I'll know that I'll probably need to use scarification on it. And for those ones, usually it's not going to hurt anything with those if you do it and it's not needed. That makes sense? But I will show you some online and other sources where you can find out basically the directions. All righty. Any other questions on that one? It's more so scarification, that rubbing part is just practice. And you can often see when you're doing it on the seed. You'll see the seed coat's one color, and then after you've filed away at it enough, you kind of get down to a lighter part, then you know that you're through the seed coat. And if you ever want to try it with the sandpaper, if you want to buy some like cheap alfalfa seed for like sprouting or whatever, you can use that to practice the kind of force that you use on it. But main thing is just to try it. It's not a big deal. So the other main technique I was going to talk about, because it's the main one that I use, is the cold stratification. And so I'll talk a little bit about what it is and why we need it. So a lot of the seeds, so it's breaking the dormant seed by allowing the embryo that's inside the seed to go through this kind of process where it gets ready to germinate. And it's, like I mentioned before, it's used for a lot of our local native plants because we live in a temperate climate where the seeds have to go through winter. So basically you're just mimicking the conditions of winter for the seed so that it's ready to germinate when you want it to. So you need a certain number of weeks of cold and moist. And there's a number of ways that you can do this. So you can do it by just taking your seed outside and stick it in the ground. This has not been a successful technique for me, but that's probably just user error because part of it's because most of my gardens are mulched, and a lot of times the mulch will slide down onto where I put the seed and cover it up, and then it doesn't germinate very well in the spring. The other ways to do this are to do it in pots. So it's just like you'd pot up any old vegetable seed or whatever. You pot it up, but then you do it in January or February and you set it outside and you let it go through the freezing and thawing that occurs in our weather. And it'll naturally go through this process. And then in the spring, it'll eventually start to germinate. So this is a picture of my friend's pots that she has on the north side of her house. So it's in the shade. And then she put those screens on there to keep the critters out. There's some like squirrels and stuff that are digging in them. So that's why it looks like that. Another way to do it, and eventually she got around to making like a wet sand bed, just taking a bunch of sand, making it damp and then sinking the pots in it. So that's another way. But basically, I'm apparently too impatient. So I go for the refrigerator method. So what you need for the refrigerator method, and you guys are going to do the same method, except for you're going to do it on paper towels or coffee filters. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your coffee filters. And you can do this paper towels too, but I'm not that fond of paper towels because if you leave them too long, the roots grow into the paper towel. And then you have this choice of if you're going to try and pull the seedling out of the paper towel or cut up the paper towel and plant the whole thing or what. But the coffee filters are not so much problem with that. So you can take your coffee filter, you can dampen it, and then you can put your seed on it, make a sandwich or roll it up, and then put it into a plastic baggie and stick it in the fridge. Another method that I use, which is the main one that I use, is with perlite. So you need some kind of medium. So it can be perlite, which is what I use. And the reason I use the perlite is because it's super white. It does the job. And because it's white, I can see the little seeds in there. And I can see if the little roots start poking out of them because they show up well against the perlite. But other things that you can use are soilless mixes, peat, vermiculite. There's a whole range of things that you can use. It's mainly the, things that won't mold because you don't want to mold in the refrigerator. So you need that, you need your seed, you need some water, you need some labeling supplies, and you need your container. So this is my thing of perlite. So this will probably last me a decade. So you don't need very much perlite if you buy it, because you're going to be using this stuff by the tablespoon. You don't need much of it. So what I do is I put it in a container like this, and then I add water just from the tap. I put the water on, and then I let it sit for a while, and then I tilt it out so the excess goes out. It's because you want your medium to be moist, like a wrung out sponge, but not have standing water in there, so that your seed will not have enough oxygen and drown, basically. So what I do is I do that, and then I'll use little snack size Ziplocs. You can use whatever you want. You have old yogurt containers or whatever works for you is fine. And then I'll label them. That's often the most important part, since I can't remember anything. I'll put what it is and then the date that I'm starting it, and I'll mark that. And then I'll take the baggie. I'll take maybe like a tablespoon of perlite. It's not very much. You don't need very much. Then I'll just dump it in the bag. I'll take my seed. I'll add it to that. I'll zip it up. Pretty much you're done. You stick it in the fridge at that point. So if you think this is too dry, you can always add some extra water to it. And then you can just, the main thing is that you tilt it and dump out any extra moisture. Like you said, you do not want moisture, free water sitting in the bottom of the baggie, because it'll rot your seed. So that's pretty much the whole process. It's pretty simple. So then I put them in a larger bag, and then I throw them in the refrigerator. I keep mine in the vegetable drawer. You can keep yours wherever you want. It just stays nice and corralled in my refrigerator if I stick it there. And the next part is you wait and watch. So one of the advantages of using the perlite, like I said, and then using these little baggies, is I can see the seed in there without even opening it up. I'll open it up and peer in it anyways, but I'll check it periodically and see if any little roots have started to come out. So if any roots come out, that means it's time's up. It's time to pot it up. But I'll be aiming for a certain number of weeks, and I'll show you here in a minute where you find out how many weeks you want for this thing. So then I'll just pot it up like you would any other flower or vegetable that you want to grow. So in this particular instance, I'm using some cell packs. They have that soilless seed starting mix in it. And then I just take the whole thing. I'll dump the seed and the perlite both on top of the cell packs. And then I'll sprinkle a little bit more of this soilless mix on the top of it. And then I'll water it. So sometimes I water them from the bottom. Usually the first time I'll water it from the bottom. So these cell packs are in trays. So I'll just tilt up one of the corners of the cell packs, and I'll put some warm water usually in there, because it's that soilless milk mix absorbs warm water better than cold. And so I'll wait until it comes to the top. And then I'll usually stick them like one of those greenhouse tops on it. And then I just do it with fluorescent lights in my basement. So it's a pretty simple process. Part of it comes down to timing. So that's why I put this on here. So the kind of pink circles on here are when I start my other flower and vegetable seed. It's just, some of it's like 10 weeks, some of it's a lot closer to the date that I'm shooting for. So this instance, this is Laramie. We don't have such a banana belt climate like you guys do. Usually we're aiming for June 10th. Isn't that sad? You feel sorry for me now. Anyways, so I'm aiming for this as my date when stuff goes out. And so what I do for these ones that need treatment is I'm shooting for that date. So I'll back it up. So I'll back it up however many weeks I want that little seedling to have time to grow. And so I forget if that's 8 weeks, but I put it out there as it weighs. And then you have to back it up even more because you need to account for your period that the seed is in the refrigerator. And so for most seed, like I said, I'll show you sources where you can find out how many weeks to stick it in there. But if I don't know, and I can't find information on how many weeks, my default is 8 weeks, 2 months. So I'll be starting it quite a bit earlier. So a lot of times I'm doing this in February or March for my plant out dates. So there are other techniques for getting these things started. There are a lot of them because there are a lot of nature in her wondrous variety has a lot of different ways of doing things. So, but the ones I've shown you are the most common ones. These are the ones that are a little less common. One of them is warm moist stratification. So this is for plants where the seed, when it lets go of the seed, the embryo hasn't quite developed inside of the seed. And so it needs warm, moist stratification, and that gives it the time to develop that embryo inside. And so usually with those ones, you do might be like 3 months of warm, moist stratification, and then you do some cold stratification afterwards. Others, you need to sow the seed when it's fresh, and that's like primula. So for some species, once that seed actually dries out and gets hard, like we would see in a seed packet, it has triggered a dormancy. And if you can catch it before it gets that far, it'll germinate. But if it goes all the way to drying out, it's triggered its dormancy. Another way is soaking or washing. So some seeds have chemical inhibitors in the seed coat. And if you can wash it away with enough water, it'll germinate. And so a lot of the iris have that particular mechanism. Then some, this is kind of weird, are triggered by smoke. So those that are in kind of environments that have wildfires, one of their mechanisms. And so plants from chaparral, like in California or Australia, there's some species where exposure to smoke will trigger them to germinate. Then there's depulping, and that's usually used with fleshy fruits and berries. So a lot of times the pulp around the seed has inhibitor chemicals in it. So you need to get rid of the pulp in order for the seed to be able to germinate. Then some folks that really get into this will use things like gibberellic acid, which is a plant hormone that can help the embryos develop. But you really need to know what you're doing, because if you use too much of it, it can kill the seed or it can make the seedling be kind of deformed. And ethylene is used for certain kinds of seeds, such as purple coneflower, to make the germination better. And then there's some plants that get really confusing because they have more than one kind of dormancy. So peony is in that area. A lot of the peonies, you need to scarify it. So you rub the seed coat, make a hole in it. Then you warm stratify it for like 3 months. Then you cold stratify it. And then if it doesn't germinate after that, you might have to stratify it again. So some of them really make you work at it. So those are a couple of the other techniques. So which technique should you use? Take the road that's already been traveled and look it up. And you should know that sometimes the sources don't agree. So you'll find one that says one thing and something that says something else. And if in doubt, if it's a native plant for around here, like I mentioned before, I'll give it 8 weeks of cold, moist stratification. But I'll keep checking it in the refrigerator, knowing that I could very well be wrong. So that big purple plant that I had on the first side is a bloodroot. It's a Lewisia. They're super pretty. But I have been on a Lewisia kick lately. And so I got some seed, I stuck it in the refrigerator, I cold stratified it. I had great germination, but it was about a month before I was expecting it. So when that happens, you have to be ready to go. You just pot them up and start growing them under lights. Because once that dormancy is broken, the trigger has been set, everything's a go. You can't stop it and you can't turn it back, usually. And remember that when you're doing this, that failure is part of the process. So almost everybody I know that does these processes is going to have some seeds, some years that just don't germinate. And sometimes you don't know exactly why. So I'm going to stop sharing this for a second. And actually, I'm going to move over to my browser. So let me get out of here. Do you guys have any questions while I'm moving around?
What is your method for maintaining the warm, moist stratification?
Use that one a whole lot because the like I said, the ones that I usually grow are from around here, and so they generally need the cold stratification. But with the warm stratification, it's really similar to what I did with the cold, except for you can use like sand or something. And then you put the sand in there, dampen it, you can put it in a baggie, but then you just stick it somewhere where it's going to be warm. So if I'm doing something like that, I'd stick it like over my refrigerator where it's nice warm up there, and then it stays there for like 3 months. And then it's oftentimes, like I said, then those then need a cold stratification period afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's super simple. It's just as simple as a cold. So some places where you can find like the germination information, like what you're supposed to do to make it germinate. Sometimes, like Catherine did, she looked at the particular place that she bought the seed, had some instructions on what to do to make them germinate. So you can look on there. This is a site by the Ontario Rock Garden and Hardy Plant Society. So I don't know, any of you but rock gardeners out there? I grow a lot of rock garden type plants. We tend to like to grow a lot of weird stuff. And so we have a lot of information on how to make them germinate. And so this particular one has a whole database of different plants, and you just click on it. And so this is from Canada, so everything's in Celsius. So it lists the temperature for how many weeks, and this particular one needs it warm. So this is one of those warm stratification, and then cold stratification. And then it gives you a little more instruction on how to make it germinate. So you can look at this whole database. You can just type in here what you're interested in looking up, and it'll return what they have, information they have on it. I like buying a lot of my seed from All Plains. It's a company out of Colorado. And the reason I like it, so I'm a little geeky myself. And so I'll be looking for stuff that's native to our area, and they carry a lot of the species I'm interested in. They sell them in small packets. And so that's nice. But then also, even if you didn't buy stuff from here, you can go and look up a plant. So these are all different species of Penstemon. There's a lot of them. They'll have this little code after it. So this is Penstemon iridis. Might be pretty tiny for you guys. Let me see if I can make it a little better. There we go. So this is one of the Penstemons, one that I grow. It shows how big it's going to get, how wide and tall the plant's going to get. And then it says what USDA zone it's going to be good in. So this one's zone 4. So this is a perennial. It says it needs a little light to germinate. That's what the L stands for. And then this 3 is a code for cold stratification. And this 8W means you should do it for 8 weeks. So your directions are all right there. So the main thing that you need to use this one is you need to know the scientific name of the plant. So you might want to look it up if you don't already know it. And then you can look it up, and it's really easy. So there's a couple other sites that you can get information on. This one's, it's kind of geared more for nurseries. And so I was looking at it the other day, and sometimes they say, cold stratify it for 5 months. and maybe they get really great germination after 5 months, but I doubt I'm ever going to have the patience and remember to do it for 5 months. So most of the times it'll be shorter time periods than that. So, or you might be just surfing around the web and you'll come across this one, which is the kind of thing that I like. This is one of the plants you'll be working on tonight, that false indigo. And so this gentleman is my kind of person because he's gone through all these experiments on how to best germinate. So basically you're just finding out what somebody's tried before, and then you give it a shot and see if it works for you. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions on that? Too much information? It's all really pretty simple once you figure out what you want to grow. And then you can look it up. And like I said, if you can't find it, you can always just guess. So I do that fairly often, do some guessing. So a couple other things before we're done. I was just going to talk about some of your plants that you have tonight. So Catherine put together a nice handout about your plants. And so you can pull that and look at it as we go or not. So one of them is Pearly Everlasting. And the reason I put this kind of information below it is to show you that sources can vary. So like this one, it says you can do 30 days cold stratification. And then 3 other sources I looked up, it said, don't worry about doing anything. Just plant it like a tomato or something, right? So this, oftentimes the treatments kind of vary by plant family. So a lot of them that are in the sunflower or aster family oftentimes don't need much cold stratification. Whereas we already discussed the ones that are in like the pea family, they need scarification, the rubbing. And so that's the next one on the list is the one we were talking about, the dwarf blue indigo, sometimes called false indigo. It needs the scarification because it's in that pea family. So one source says scarify it and that's good enough. The other one said scarify it and then give it 10 days of cold stratification in the freezer. And then another source said just scarify it. So you just look at it and decide, I'm going with that one. And you go with whichever one looks appealing to you. So you have the clustered poppy mallow on your list. It's a real pretty, it's in that poppy mallow family. They're related to hollyhocks. And so this particular one is one of the ones you need to scarify. And so one of the instructions said scarify it and then stratify it for 6 weeks. So this one's one you might, so these are flax seeds. So you could just use your nail clippers and clip it to break the seed coat. And then you do that cold stratification in it. Or you get to choose that, or you can choose to scarify it by using hot water. And so this hot water 24 hours means that you take boiling water, you pour it on the seed, and then you just leave it in the water for 24 hours and the water just cools off and then it starts to, the hot part of it helps break the seed coat. The cold water will soak in and start the germination process. So as you can see, there are different ways of doing it. The next one is your New Jersey tea. So this is kind of in the shrub kind of area of plants. And a lot of times the shrubs and the trees are a little tougher to get to germinate than a lot of the perennial plants. And so they can be a little more complicated. So for that particular one, you'll have the instructions on your sheet, which is probably what you'll use tonight. You can also use these ones, which are to scarify it. So rub it, do a warm water soak, and then you have 3 months of cold stratification. Do you have any questions on these? Going too fast? You have your sheets to look at as you do it. So, but part of this was just to show you that there can be varying opinions out there, and that's okay. It's not a big deal. So for the Monarda, which is the mint, in the mint family, it's the bee balm family. She's got you the spotted bee balm. And so that's one that you don't need to do any of that fancy stuff with it. It just has small seed. And so a lot of times with the small seed, they'll often say to surface sow it. So that means just put it right on top of your potting mix so that the light can get to it. Because sometimes the small ones, if they get buried too deep, they don't get enough light to stimulate the germination that they need. I see that y'all, looks like y'all have the handouts now. Do you have any questions on these? I'm sure you're going to go through each one by one. This is just kind of an overview to give you an idea of what's coming. So the next one, she's got 2 goldenrods that she got you. One stiff goldenrod and the other one showy goldenrod. And so for each of these, you can see there's a little variation with opinion. Some of them say to cold stratify it for 60 days. Others say just plant it and don't worry about it. So it just depends which one you want to go with. I can tell you that when you put it in your gardens, goldenrods tend to travel. So you want to put it somewhere where it has space to itself, unless you want it kind of spreading around. They like to spread quite a bit. The next one is in one of my more favorite genus of plants, and that's the Penstemons or beard tongues. So the one she got you is hairy beard tongue. And like many Penstemons, they suggest doing 8 weeks of cold stratification. A lot of the Penstemons, there's some that don't call for any cold stratification, but a lot of them that are native to around where we are do. And then the last ones we have down here, one is the Heath Aster. So it's a type of aster, has little bitty flowers on it. And they say it needs some light and some dry stratification, which I think you could also accomplish just by storing the seed dry without doing much of anything to it and then just planting it. But here they're talking about maybe sticking in the refrigerator and pack it and leaving it there. And then finally, there's this cute little Prairie Violet that she got you, which I think looks really cool. And I've looked at it before, but I've never tried it before. It has a bit of a more complicated and challenging way to get it out of dormancy. And for this one, they say you can cold stratify it for 60 days, or you can just plant it outdoors to go through the cycle of freezing and thawing and temperature swings that happen outside. Or you can do it inside, but you might need to do some of the temperature cycling yourself, which is you put it in the refrigerator for a while, then you have it out for a while, then you put it in the refrigerator for a while, then you have it out for a while. So you just kind of go back and forth like Mother Nature would. Does that all make sense? I know there was a lot. That was just kind of giving you a rough idea of some of the things you're going to do tonight. And the fact that when you go to look for things, you should not be alarmed if it shows you a variety of opinions on how to do things. You just pick one that looks good to you and you go for it. Not be too worried about it. Any questions? So you sent you to sleep?
No, we're wide awake here. Once these seeds germinate, they get going and they get potted up. Since we're starting a little late in the season, being mid-May, and 60 days puts us in the middle of summer, and you figure once you pot it up and it starts growing, it's got to get at least a transplant size.
Yep.
And it puts us towards the end of the growing season. How would you suggest that the master gardeners handle these little plants? Should they just keep them in pots or should we try to plant them?
There's two, you could do it either way. So you could either go ahead and stick it in the ground and give it a shot with that way, or you can keep the pots outside and stick them. If I did that, I would be tempted to just stick them in the ground. So I'd sink them in the ground, and so that they have the protection of the ground around them, around the roots. They may just be fine. So when you think about it, one of the things I didn't say about dormancy is that it's a strategy of plants to survive, right? And so one of the strategies is if all my progeny, all my babies come up at the same time and there's some freak weather event, they'll all get wiped out. And so a lot of plants, they stagger their germination over time. So you'll have there's a lot of seedlings that are coming up right now that you've seen, I'm sure too, especially the weeds. I always see the weeds first. Why is that? But anyways, there's a lot of plants germinating, but there'll still be plants germinating in the middle of summer. So that's one way to handle it. Another way to handle it is if you have enough seed, do the stratification and stuff now, and then take some home and then be prepared to do it next year, come February, if you have enough. But I would practice it tonight so you get a feel for the techniques. Like I said, especially with the sandpaper, it's helpful it's a really kind of a a feely thing where you feel, you do it a little bit kind of tentatively, and then you pick it up and look at it and see if you made any progress, and then you do a little harder until you kind of get to the sweet spot where you're getting through it, but you're not crushing them.
I've got 200 grit sandpaper, so it's not real aggressive, but if you put too much pressure on it, it's going to become very aggressive. So this is kind of a feel, because you don't want to grind your little seed into flour. You just want to abrade that seed coat so that the water can penetrate. So yeah, it's an experimental night, and so that's what this is all about. And practice on what I've got. And then once you feel comfortable, you can go through the catalog or through the internet and find some seeds that you really want to try to grow. All the seeds I got support pollinators in one way or the other. So they either support some butterflies, or they support some bees or larva plants. So they all are pollinator helper plants. So that was real important in the criteria I was looking for. Some of them I'm already growing in my yard, so I know that they grow here and they will do well. And any other questions for Jenny?
Have any questions about particular plants you're interested? I may or may not know the answer. If they're trees or shrubs, I might not.
When you were talking about putting the pots, like to try to overwinter them as you get our seeds, so could you use the sand bed process that you said your friend uses, where she created the sand bed and dropped the pots into there when she was doing her winter stratification?
I didn't quite hear the first part of that. Sorry.
I'm sorry, you had said earlier with like if we get our seedlings growing, and you had said that maybe one of the possibilities was to try to overwinter them.
Yep.
Assuming in pots in the ground to overwinter them. Could you use that sand bed technique?
You bet.
That
Mhm.
earlier? Okay.
Yeah, my friend has, she's like sometimes she'll have stuff that germinates late. And so they'll go through the whole summer in those little pots, and then they'll go through another winter, and then she'll plant them out. So yeah, the sand beds, I keep thinking one of these days, maybe I'll make one myself. I got a little bit of sand bed jealousy, but I haven't got around to it yet. So, but the main thing is, yeah, you want to, the sand in there, and then you want to water the sand too when you're watering your plants, because it just keeps it moister than, so it doesn't, your little pots will dry out a lot less than if you had your little pots just sitting on the ground.
I have a question. I tried putting the pots in the ground for overwintering, but the wind blew the sand, the soil away. So what can you put on top of the pots to keep the wind from blowing seeds away?
I feel your pain. I've been there. So I use those little cell packs, you know, and sometimes it completely blows the whole pack away. So yeah, I know. So what I've done is sometimes I'll put those little greenhouse tops on it, and then I'll put rocks on it to keep it down and keep it from blowing away. I also have it, so when I do them over the winter, I will do them on the north side of my house, because it's the temperatures are more stable there. They won't dry out as bad. And so I put them on that side. And so I've got them sitting, so my porch is there. It's on the upwind side. And then my flats are hunkered down behind it, hiding. So they're shielded from the wind. And then I also have my rocks or my boards or whatever else I'm using to weight it down on top of it. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, that's a big problem that we have.
Are you planting your seeds in like a regular garden, or are you putting them like out on the prairie?
I'm putting mine in a regular garden. So I put them in beds. So something like, so I talk a lot about, let's see, I probably don't have any handy photos of my stuff. Well, I might, I'll look. But a lot of mine are beds. So all my plants that I choose have to play well with others because there's some really super lovely native plants that I really like, but I have to enjoy them in nature because they will run rampant through my beds and trying to take them over. There's some of the evening primroses. I really love evening primroses, but there's a lot that I will not have in my beds because they're very rhizomatous. They will travel like lightning and they'll pop up everywhere. And so I'm pretty choosy. Now, if it was in a pasture like setting, you know, or like a wildflower kind of pasture thing, I wouldn't be so worried about that, because in nature, there's all this competition, and it being so dry and everything just keeps it more controlled, where it's just slightly bit better in my beds, just enough that they'll just go and run for it. So, but I like it. One of the really nice things about having native plants in your beds is that you get to observe them all season long. Like, you know, when you're hiking around, it's nice to see them, but you can watch them go through their whole life cycle, and you get to know them really well. And you get to see all the cool pollinators that visit them and all that good stuff.
A lot of these seeds that we're going to be working with today, they grow in my yard where I don't have grass. It's just open. But they're not really very big. And I was looking at the pictures that you had on the screen behind you when you first started.
Wow. Yeah.
And those flowers were very large.
Yes.
How does that happen?
So it
Mine
depends
are
what,
tiny.
right. I know what you mean. So it depends what kind of competition they have. Let me pull that up again.
How about
So
the action of the soil?
some of it has to do with the soil, like how well drained it is, but a lot of it has to do with the competition. So you said there wasn't much growing there. So usually nature is it'll fill in every empty spot that you have with something, except for there's, in some of our prairies, there's areas of kind of blank space around plants, but there's probably some roots under there doing stuff that we can't see. And so what you saw in the picture behind me was this bloodroot, and that was the one I was showing you the little plant of in the pot. And so that one is pretty spectacular. The plant, the flowers are about, I don't know, 2 inches across. The plants don't look like anything at all. So they're these fleshy little succulent. You'd think they were a succulent. Maybe they are, I don't know, in a strict definition of a succulent. But they got these little fat, squishy leaves. They look like grass. They're super easy to overlook, but how it grows is kind of weird, as it'll pop these little leaves up like this time of year. Late winter, early spring, the leaves come up, these fleshy little things. You'll barely notice they're there. And then after a while, the blooms will come out. And then it'll throw open this bloom, it'll produce seed, and then the whole plant shrivels away. And there won't be anything sticking out for the rest of the summer. And so it's super easy to accidentally dig them up. I've done that before. So it's one of those things you want to mark. I think I got off the point of your question, which was, why are things smaller in nature? It's just because of lack of resources. Usually is what I've observed. So there's not quite as much water. There's not quite as much space. Even if there's not competition above the ground that you can see, there's stuff going on below the ground. So a lot of, like I said, some of these, this particular evening primrose is one that I have that I really like, but it's a kind of mounding form. It's not rhizomatous like those other ones I was talking about. So you can have these rhizomatous roots running underground that you don't see that are competing with those plants. Does that make sense? So I will see that a lot, where the plants will be smaller in nature, but when I put them in my beds, they just have just that smidge extra resources and water. I don't water that much, but still it's just enough more than they get in nature that they get bigger. Does that make sense?
Yes. What is this beautiful plant down here that's violet with yellow centers?
Oh, that's one of my favorites. That's a Pulsatia patens. It's also called, let's see, I think windflower is one of its name. Passflower is another name. It's the state flower of several states, I think, including South Dakota. And it's one that you almost never find in the nursery trade. And so I grew it from seed. It germinates reasonably well. It is slow of a grower. It'll take, this plant's probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old. So it starts out with this little wispy thing, and it takes several years for it to kind of bulk up and bloom like that. But when it blooms, it's like it's about to be over blooming right now for me up in Laramie. So you can tell it's one of the first things to bloom of the native plants. And the bees will be all over it. And it forms these crazy little seed heads that look like, I don't know, Dr. Seuss hair. And they'll reseed themselves if they're happy where they're at. Good question. It's in the ranunculus family, so they tend to be poisonous plants, so not as many critters eat them, which also can be beneficial. Any other questions? There's a bunch of different penstemons. This one's a shell leaf penstemon. This little guy, you don't see him. It's another one you're not going to find in the nursery trade. It's called larch leaf penstemon. It's a cute little guy. He's only about this tall. I stick him in the areas between my pavers. I have like a rock path around my place and then like some kind of patio areas, and I'll stick that little guy in between the rocks. And so it looks a lot like grass until it blooms. And this is firecracker penstemon, which the hummingbirds always go crazy over. So those are some of those plants. So a lot of times with, it seems like with the native plants, like I was talking with that passflower, it's super slow to grow, but it lives longer. So some of our native plants just naturally, they don't have long lives. Like a lot of my penstemons, they'll live, oh, I don't know, 3 years, and then they'll give it up. So they throw out seed, that's how they propagate, and then the original plant will die out and the seeds will stay there. Any other questions? There's a lot of fantastic plants out there. That's why you go through all the little bit of extra work it takes to get the dormancy broken to have them grow, because they're hard to find in the nurseries. Though they're getting better about bringing more of our native plants into nurseries and being able to buy them.
Yeah, that's a slow one that's happening, getting the native plants into the nursery trade. Nice to see more native plants to buy.
Mm-hmm.
So any more questions, Jenny?
Looks like you're gonna have some fun.
Yeah, you think of your questions now, because once Jenny says goodbye, we don't have Jenny's expertise. And so you're gonna have to read the directions in your little handouts to figure out how to go forward.
If I didn't transmit it well enough, it's all pretty darn easy. So don't worry about it too much. Okay. And there's always next year, like in gardening. It's always our mantra, right? Next year.
Absolutely. Okay, Jenny, thank you very much for spending your evening, a little bit of your evening with us.
Sure.
And if you would send me a PDF version of your PowerPoint, and I'll get it to everybody tonight.
I'll do that.
Okay.
You guys have fun. Wish I was there. Playing with seed.
Okay, if you guys want to take a quick break. For those of you who are new to up on this floor, the bathrooms are to the right of the elevator. And yeah, you all have your own water, so that's good. So why don't we take a quick break, and I can get my technology back in order. Maybe.